Welcome back to Disciplinary Literacy with Jackson Rogers. Last time, we talked about the characteristics of learners like metacognition, critical thinking, and sociocultural backgrounds. In this episode, I would like to discuss the final two characteristics of learners: motivation and identity, and how they affect literacy practices and proficiencies in the classroom. First, I'd like to talk about the characteristic of motivation. As I've talked before in this series about having your students buy in, to have them own their own education. Motivation is something that I personally have struggled with. This semester with the pandemic, I have had little to no motivation to finish out the semester. This has given me an insight into what my students will be facing in a way that I probably wouldn't have understood before. If students aren't properly motivated when they come to class, I won't be able to teach them content knowledge, to get them engaged, to open up concepts of literacy to them, because without motivation, students don't see a point. Many times, students need help to be motivated. Self-motivation isn't always possible for a student. Motivation can be modeled by the teacher or facilitated by the teacher. But sometimes we will have to step back and see that there are things in our students' lives that are bigger than school, that are going on at home, that are going on around them, that are stressing them out and causing anxiety because they don't feel comfortable in the classroom. These stressors are a real killer of motivation. Students that struggle with anxiety and depression will have a much harder time motivating themselves to learn anything in your class. My hope is to be able to inspire students to reach out, to work with them, to work with their parents, and to work with their communities. If the student is someone from a different background or a different language background, that student deserves all the support that I can afford. If they're working a job after school because they have to help mom and dad, or if the student just simply has an issue with anxiety and depression, I have to work harder to make certain that that student still gets a fair chance. Mental illness and the lack of motivation should not be a hindrance to literacy development in a student. This reminds me of the discussion and the reading that we had, The Girl Who Wouldn't Sing by Kit Yuen Quan. That piece really spoke to me, and it's because this girl felt blocked from education. There were things that she obviously was good at. She obviously is a creative person, but her teacher's failure to address the issue and help that student through her anxiety about speaking English left her in a situation where she didn't feel seen. She was just a girl from a minority family who seemed to be able to get along fine, but was terrified every time she was asked to speak aloud in English. This also brings up the idea of depression and anxiety. In the piece, Quan talks about her coming out to her family and being outcasted from her community and running away from home and school. I don't pretend to know whether or not intervention from a teacher that had gained Quan's respect would have changed the end of her story. and brought her to a place where she could thrive in an academic setting. The sad truth of that story is that in the end, she still feels anxiety when she has to speak in English. She still feels anxiety about her sexual orientation. Her family life was something completely beyond the control of her teachers. I hope that I can be a teacher that reaches out to students and reaches out to families and can try and help that student focus on their schoolwork even through the midst of terrible events. I hate to think of how lonely students must feel when they come from a background that disagrees with the way they are. So they don't feel at home when they're home, and then they don't feel at home when they're at school because everyone's speaking a language that they struggle with. Motivation is such a key characteristic to literacy. I will never forget how the teachers have helped to motivate me during this pandemic when I've lost all self-motivation. I hope that that carries into the way that I deal with my students one day. I hope to meet students where they're at, whether it be an anxiety that comes from having linguistic diversity, or if it's as simple as times are hard, that student just can't pull it together. Because without motivation, teaching disciplinary literacy is impossible. The final characteristic of the learner that I would like to look at is identity and its influence on literacy practices and proficiency in the classroom. When I thought about identity before this class, I thought of it as this very monolithic thing. The only person who shapes it would be me. My identity is my own. After talking about this at length, identity is so attached to so many things. Specifically, we talked about 4 kinds of identity. We talked about master identities, interactional identities, personal identities, and relational identities. This was such an interesting concept to me because, like I said, I've always thought of an identity as something that the person themselves shape. Master identities are something that are shaped for you. It's stable things like where you were born or the color of your skin. Now, master identities can be shaped by the outside world as time rolls along. They are socially constructed on whether or not being a white woman and being a black woman have the same sorts of inferences that come with that identity. It all depends on the time and place. The struggles of a woman are separate from the struggles of race. So those are master identities. Then we also discussed interactional identities. These are identities that provide context. For instance, being the oldest son in your family, or being a father, or maybe you're a teacher or an accountant. This identity is something that describes the person and a fact about them, a function that person lives in. Interactional identities are also pretty set in stone, though someone can, throughout their life, develop their interactional identity. It's more of a long-term goal. We talked about personal identities, and this is where the characteristic of identity really starts to take a dynamic form. Personal identity refers to the way that people behave toward others. For instance, being honest or kind, or being a gossip, or someone who's haughty all the time. This personal identity is shaped and formed by the individual throughout their entire life. And then we have relational identities. Relational identities change from context to context. Relational identities probably shocked me the most because it is such a simple concept, but we don't think about the fact that from time to time, our relationship develops with other people. And the meaning of a relationship can vary depending on how healthy it is, or how healthy one of the individuals or unhealthy one of the individuals are. These identities are, we talked about it, called identities in practice. Both personal and relational identities are very dynamic. This reminds me of Baker's piece about trilingualism, and I spoke about this in one of the earlier episodes. If students learn to see literacy as a third language that they can adopt and have an identity as an academic, then they'll become actively engaged within the discourse community. Teachers must understand the multifaceted nature of identity and the way that it relates to literacy in their class. Baker makes a good argument for helping students to develop that identity of themselves as an academic and to celebrate the identity that they already have in their home. Students struggle with identity formation just like everyone else. And that's why, as teachers, we need to be compassionate. I hope to create a space where students feel recognized and seen and respected in the identity that they're forming, and to foster healthy identity formation in my students. And that wraps up the characteristics of learners and how they affect literacy in the classroom. I'll see you next time with some strategies that I plan on using after taking this course for disciplinary literacy in my own classroom.